Hello and welcome. I'm Crawford Coates, the Content Marketing Manager here at Lexipol, and I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your day to attend today's webinar, Emotional Survival 2.0, Wellness Solutions for Today's Law Enforcement Professional. Today's webinar features Dr. Kevin Gilmartin and Dr. David Black, whom many of you will know. But before we get to them, I'd like to review just a few housekeeping notes. First of all, you'll be joining us in listen-only mode. I'd like to thank you for those of you who submitted questions in advance of the webinar. Time permitting, we are going to be able to answer some of those questions at the end. The session is being recorded, so we'll send you an email by the end of the day today with a link to this recording. Additionally, we will be providing certificates of attendance for the session. These will arrive in a separate email again by the end of the day. If you have any questions, please email us at webinars@lexipol.com. And just a friendly reminder that today's webinar is for general educational purposes. It is not meant to be legal or medical advice. So to introduce today's speakers, again, they're probably familiar to most of you, but Dr. David Black is the founder and president of Cortico, a public safety wellness app that's now part of Lexipol. He's a recognized subject matter expert in first responder health and wellness. He sits on the boards of IACP, National Sheriff's Association, the Fraternal Order of Police, and others. And additionally, his professional experience includes hospitals, Fortune 100 companies, and other organizations outside of first response. He will be talking today with Dr. Kevin Gilmartin, who literally wrote the book on law enforcement wellness. Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement was published in 2002, and it's become, it was groundbreaking at the time. It's become a classic in the years since. He wrote this book after 23 years as a police officer in Tucson, Arizona. We are just so thankful to have both of them here today. So with that, I'll leave it to you, Dr. Black and Dr. Gilmartin. Take it away.
Thank you, Crawford.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Crawford, and thank you to everyone watching for your service, your sacrifices, for all you do. This webinar is for you, and I can't overstate how much we appreciate you all. Thank you also to Lexipol for hosting and making this webinar possible. And thank you so much, especially to Dr. Gilmartin, for the very special opportunity to present with you today. You know, law enforcement professionals now face absolutely unprecedented challenges. You, law enforcement professionals, you've worked through the worst pandemic ever faced by modern law enforcement. No one else has ever done that. At the same time, you've dealt with unprecedented social unrest, political challenges, targeted attacks against law enforcement heroes, and countless other changes that have made policing more and more demanding, difficult, and challenging than ever before in the history of the profession. The truth is that low morale, burnout, and fatigue are being experienced by many. Dr. Gilmartin, can we please start off by getting your thoughts on the current challenges faced by law enforcement?
Well, you know, Dr. Black, I would just reiterate what you just said. I've been around a really long time, and I've never seen anything like what our police officers have to go through today. They've always been my heroes in terms of what they do and how they serve us. But I look at how a whole underbelly of society has turned against them, and stress is just so terribly magnified in their life right now that we really need to double down on our efforts to assist them, to really target what's happening in their lives, because it's almost like it's in a microwave. It just intensifies so quickly. So just those few topics that you mentioned right there, plus the doxing of officers, the specific threats against their families, those are things I'm not sure American police have ever dealt with before.
Absolutely true. And you see a lot now of people purposely going out of their way to push the buttons of law enforcement, push officers' buttons, and just try to get a reaction, very purposely trying to provoke and get a reaction. Combined with the political opposition, a lot of micromanagement at a political level, and direct opposition and lack of support. So very, very difficult times. Given these very challenging times, emotional survival for law enforcement has become more important than ever. Dr. Gilmartin, I'm sure you'd agree with that.
Well, we've always been aware of the stresses on police officers after traumatic exposure. But in today's climate, we have these phone slingers that just monitor the scanners and show up at every police call just to confront and harass the police officer. So just a basic call for services for a police officer is a fertile ground for confrontation and intensified stress for the officer. We were really, personally, I think this will be, when all is said and done, this will be a growth experience in our profession of law enforcement, because out of adversity, we learn advantage. Necessity is the mother of invention, and we have to look at ways to assist our officers every day, not making it just some superficial add-on, but we can't expect human beings to perform every day in this type of stressful environment and make critical decisions and judgment calls like we're asking our police officers to do without intensifying their services in the whole emotional and physical health area.
Right, absolutely. I know this is the case for you as well, but so many people have approached me and said, in the past, if my son or daughter had wanted to go into law enforcement, I would have supported that. I would have told them what an honorable, wonderful career. If that's what you want to do with your life, wonderful. And now so many people tell me, and they've been saying this for several years now, that they would actually dissuade their children from going into the profession, that they would say, look for something else. It's too tough to do this. You're just not supported the way we were in the past. Do you hear similar things?
Well, every day I
Yeah.
hear those things, but what troubles me is I find myself saying those things, and that troubles me. Speaking to a young member of my family who wants to enter law enforcement, I was just asking them to really think this through. Then I felt terribly guilty about saying that to them, because we want the best in our society, and as you look at the research, departments are having a significant reduction in recruiting applications, and at the same time an intensification and increase in the retirement factors. So we're losing really good people, and are we able to bring in and recruit the best of the young generation to come in? And those are challenges that management has to address and communities have to address. I think it's a spin-off from Sir Robert Peel, but I knew Robert Kennedy way back as the Attorney General made a statement. He said, every community has the police department that it deserves. And that makes you think, if a community cannot appreciate the sacrifices of the men and women of law enforcement, then they will have a police department that reflects that. When communities appreciate the sacrifices of the men and women of law enforcement, and they provide services, and they augment and add to the lives of those men and women, then the whole quality of life in those communities increases. It's not an inaccurate statement that the more the defund the police movement increases, the more police officers retire from those departments, and the quality of life decreases, and the rates of crime are increasing. So we're having to look at this unprecedented time and provide services to keep good people good and to keep them in the profession and attracted to seeing law enforcement as a noble profession.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think society in so many ways has lost sight of that fact that this is the groundwork that everything else in our society is built upon, is the people out there on the front lines doing the most difficult, dangerous work every day. I always say your average person would never say, sure, for my career, I will strap on body armor, carry a sidearm, and run towards shots fired. I'll deal with the most dangerous people, most dangerous situations in our community every single day. I'll do it under intense pressure, and often to serve and save the lives of people whose names I don't even know. These aren't your average people who sign up to do these jobs. These are very, very special people. They're tough, they're resilient, they're courageous on a level that I think the average person fails to appreciate and understand. And given all the pressure that the profession's under right now, and the fact that we're having a harder and harder time recruiting and retaining people in the profession, it really emphasizes and reinforces the fact that emotional survival is more important now than probably ever in the history of the profession for law enforcement. So, Dr. Gilmartin, what specific core principles of emotional survival deserve some renewed attention and focus during these unprecedented times?
You know, one of the real core foundational concepts that we speak about in our work in emotional survival is the capacity to differentiate what you do control and what you do not control. And so many of the factors that you and I have just been talking about right now are things that are out of the control of the average law enforcement professional. It'd be wonderful if they could control the political atmosphere of their community, if they could control the behavior of citizens who are harassing them, but they can't. So if we're being exposed daily to things that we do not control, then we really have to have a part of our life that we do control. And that means that we have to be able to detach from the police role and reattach to the family role, the friend role, the hobbyist role, and have a life that permits us to have a life that we are a survivor in. And this has always been one of the big differences, in my opinion, when I've looked at firefighters and looked at police officers. And that's the concept of time and the capacity to have time to have different roles in our life, to have different sub-occupations and time to be with family and time to exercise, and to take some of the foundational concepts of emotional survival to heart and practice them. And law enforcement officers typically don't get that time. They're in the meat grinder the entire day. Then, just due to the realities of scheduling, it's very easy for them to have all of the issues that create emotional victimization, sleep disorder, lack of physical attention to stress. And we have to increase our training and our services to police officers and see that this is not some secondary benefit, but it's a core skill set that they have to have. I'm astounded at what a good job our police are doing in the confrontations that they're exposed to. It just astounds me to watch the abuse they're taking and the restraint and emotional control that they're doing. But I worry about what happens when they get off duty and they go home. Do they have the skills to turn that off, to switch from being a police officer to being a mother or to being a father, and to increase the overall quality of their life? Those are things that worry me. And I'm hoping police leadership take those seriously and realize that those are skills they must have. You know, when I look at emotional survival, I think of firearms training. Nobody would expect police officers to just on their own time pick up firearms training. You know, here's a gun, you know how it works, you know, on your Saturday, on your Sunday, go out to the range and crank off a couple of rounds and be okay shooting the gun. We don't do that. We take standard time that's part of their professional curriculum, and they go to the range and they're taught skill sets until they master them. Well, we have to talk about human performance across the spectrum with law enforcement officers the same way. These are services that have to be given to officers. They need to be mandated to officers, and they need to be on while the officer's on duty. That's what we're looking at issues. You know, every so often over the course of a career, you run into people that just kind of catch your attention. Two really stand out to me. One is Dr. John Violante, with all of the great empirical scholarly work he has done articulating what happens to police. And the other is Gordon Graham. And Gordon's been known for his tips and his little known for a lot of things, but one of the things that Gordon has always impressed me with is how to take a complex concept and make it simple. And one of his first that every cop that's ever heard of knows is, if it's predictable, it's preventable. If it's predictable, it's preventable. Decades, Gordon has been telling that to the law enforcement community. Well, we can predict that things like heart disease, stroke, are going to occur to law enforcement officers to the level that some states make them presumptive injuries, yet we still don't try to prevent those issues. We know that cops are going to be exposed to traumatic events. The trauma exposures, part of what happens in policing, but we still don't spend the efforts to try to prevent the disorders from occurring. We try to treat them once they occur, but moving into the prevention issue, and very much like firearms, we want our cops to be proficient. Well, stress management basically means, do we have people who can go out and make rapid reaction time judgment calls? And that's human performance. And it's time that it's seen as a core element of policing, not necessarily just a clinical service that's there for them, but as part of their skill set.
Absolutely. And, so many great points, Dr. Gilmartin. I appreciate it so much. And one thing you talk about that I wish more people would talk about is that singular identity and how that occurs over the course of the law enforcement career. And you really touched on that. And a couple other real key principles that you've been so well known for, hypervigilance, and then the biological roller coaster that ensues. Could you revisit those topics for us?
It was always amazing to me how we talk about the psychological concepts of policing and what psychologically occurs to police officers, but we don't hear anything about the physical challenges to police. And I sort of look at this through a different lens than a lot of my colleagues do, because I'm a lot older than they are, and we were joking about being the Keith Richards of police mental health here. But starting way back in the 1970s, it was strictly a clinical service. We had a few pioneer psychologists around the country who were providing counseling services to police. Very necessary, very important. And then by the 1980s, that had grown to the point the FBI had the first World Symposium on police psychological services. Agent Jim Reese attempted to identify every psychologist in the country that was working with police. And I think he identified 200, and he brought them all back to Quantico. But it was interesting to look that almost all were clinical psychologists or psychiatric social workers. There wasn't anybody really representing any other professions there. And all of a sudden, we equated emotional survival with counseling, and we equated it with providing services after trauma. All very, very important issues, but nobody talked about how do we talk about preventing heart disease in our cops as they grow older? How do we prevent the physiological challenges? And the hypervigilance concept was that it wasn't so much what cops had to see at work, in my opinion, but how cops had to look at things that was so damaging to them. The average person doesn't have to look at the world the way a law enforcement professional has to. The average person makes some assumptions of normalcy for the most part. And we've talked about this in the past about it being probability thinking. Most people can make decisions based on what's probably going to happen. A cop, a dispatcher, or any first responder basically can't do normal thinking of what's probably going to happen. They have to talk about what's possibly going to happen. So when they're on duty, they're constantly thinking about the worst case scenario in every situation, where they stand, how they approach a car, putting on ballistic body armor. And that type of thinking reduces tactical casualties, but it really increases emotional casualties, because when the officer or the dispatcher is in that elevated state, they're in this heightened level of alertness. I can't imagine, for example, walking into a maximum security prison where you're working every day without having this elevated level of alertness to your environment and what's going on around you. That's hypervigilance. And we teach this, we preach this, and it makes our officers occupationally safer while they're doing his or her job. But the problem is it's biological, and that's that sympathetic autonomic nervous system pushing the person into this elevated alertness. Cops have to maintain that state the entire time they're on duty. The problem is when they get off duty, that sympathetic autonomic response becomes a parasympathetic response, where they're detached, they're isolated, and they're disengaged. And that's where we see this damage. And that damage occurs, and the officer pulls back from social engagements, they pull back from recreational pursuits. So we end up, as the years progress, starting with a very idealistic person who's been psychologically screened, who's physically fit, and then we put them into this job that they're only prepared, in my opinion, for half the job, and that's the on-duty time. They're prepared to do the job, but we don't prepare them for what happens in their personal life when they get off duty, and then we start having the casualties. And those casualties are both psychological and physiological. And as the career expands and goes forth, those casualties, they mount up. And we start taking that idealistic person and we make them a terribly cynical, sarcastic person. You know, when you think of normal relationships, trust is a very essential part of a normal relationship. Yet trust is not the friend of a law enforcement officer. All law enforcement officers don't survive by trusting there's not a gun in the car or trusting the person's not armed. They have to make a worst case scenario assumption. And that type of thinking is effective on duty, but is so terribly destructive in their personal life. And as I look at this, I would like to see academies and I would like to see in-service training make this a higher priority as to what the transition is, not just to assume an officer is going to get off duty and just flow right back into normal thinking, because my experience tells me that does not happen. And there's certain precursors that we can see that we're not hiring officers for 2 and 3 years duration. We're hiring them for career choices. And we have to be able to show that officer as their technical expertise grows over the years. We want their emotional foundation to grow and solidify also.
Absolutely. And you know, you said it so well, quoting Gordon Graham, if it's predictable, it's preventable. And as you emphasize, law enforcement are psychologically screened more than any other profession at a national scale. And then they come into this with this toughness, this resilience, very low risk for mental health problems, very low risk for suicide. And yet what we see is doubling of depression rates within the first 5 years on the job. We see that on average, they encounter 188 critical incidents over the course of their career, exponentially more than your average person will ever be forced to endure. And what we then see is that about 1 out of 12 are thinking of suicide in the past year alone. So I always say, think about that. If you have a 1,200 person department, just statistically on average, 100 of your people in the past year have been thinking of suicide. If you're more mid-sized, 120 personnel, on average, 10 of your people have been thinking of suicide in the past year. This is predictable. This is predictable. So we all need to be doing more, which gets us to the fact that Dr. Gilmartin, you just released the revised edition of Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. Absolutely wonderful. This is very exciting. Let's talk about why you wrote the revised edition. What is new in this version? And why is the revised edition so important for law enforcement today?
Well, thank you for that. You know, when we wrote the original book, Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement, it was written as a guide. It was written as a guide to follow our training courses and our seminars. And it really was just a compilation of what officers had told us. And there were certain themes we kept hearing from the cops. So we documented those, and that became the original book. It actually shocked us, the book. We just thought it would be something that would be available with our seminars. We had no concept of the legs that the book developed over the years. And what we found, though, was that as we were utilizing the book, and it was in parallel with the seminars evolved. We would add information in the seminars that wasn't available in 2002 till we reached a point where half of the stuff we were talking about in seminars was not in the book. And they would come up and say, well, where in the book does it talk about diabetes and policing? And we'd say, well, it kind of doesn't, you know. Oh, why don't you add that? Why don't you add that? So actually the cops wrote the book. All we did was kind of scribe it. We were just putting down what was occurring in their lives and tried to put it into a format that the cops would read. As I said, we've been shocked by the legs that the book has developed over the years. But one of the most common criticisms of the book comes from psychological colleagues. They'll say, you know, this book is very simple. It's kind of simple-minded. And I said, you know, I kind of take that as a compliment because, you know, I kind of like being simple, because if you aren't getting the simple stuff right, you ain't getting the complicated stuff right. So, and a lot of our cops get into trouble because they're not taking the simple stuff right. If we can just explain to our officers what's actually transpiring in a 24-hour day in their life and give them some corrective actions how to do that, then they will accomplish something, we believe. And over the course of the years, certain things have changed. You know, I'm astounded at how much technology has changed our lives. You know, I didn't think about this until we started putting this revised edition together, that there were concepts in the original book that don't exist anymore. You know, we talked a great deal about the magic chair, and that resonated with the old school cops. They would come home and they just drop into their magic chair and watch television. Well, I'm not sure a lot of today's cops even own a television. You know, they walk around with their digital device plugged in 24/7, and they're talking about a digital addiction where they just, when they're done with work, they just unplug from life because they've left it on the field and they're disengaged. So we revised the book. We kept the basic concepts, but we wanted to add some additional information, particularly the information on metabolic illness that impacts our officers as the years go on. And we wanted to talk about the changing dynamics and demographics of our workforce and how that's reflected. So we tried to do that in the revised edition to make it resonate with the younger officers who are facing more stress, and many times they're coming in with a need for skill sets that I don't think we're teaching, right? And I think we can. And getting back to Gordon, if it's predictable, it's preventable. As the numbers that you gave are frightening to me. And I just dealt with the aftermath of a suicide of a fine young officer. And I would challenge anybody to look at this officer's life in the last months and find evidence of mental illness. They wouldn't see it. But I would think that they would find some evidence of spiking depression immediately after work. Yeah, they would find that absolutely exhausted state that they move into each day and they're disengaged from. The more we educate officers to that, the more we can show them how to prevent that. And if you can't solve a problem if you don't know what the problem is. And we try to fix a lot of problems, but we don't prevent problems. You know, one of the things that I get astounded at sometimes is how in the United States we miss things that other places in the world are doing and take for common sense. And this hit me the first time I went to Australia to teach. I went to Australia to the police academy, and I'm there with the academy commander, and he hands me a hat to wear. Now, I've been cutting my hair this way for a long time, and I'm in Australia. He hands me this hat to wear. I said, "That's okay. I don't need to wear a hat." He goes, "Yeah, you do." I said, "Why do I need to wear a hat?" He said, "Because we have some of the highest rates of death in the world by skin cancer, and it's mandated that you wear a hat." So, okay. So I put the hat on. I'm listening to him, and I'm walking over to the auditorium. I said, "What are some of the other places that have high rates of death by skin cancer?" And he goes, "Well, one's Arizona." And I just stopped, and I'm thinking, you know, I've spent most of my life in Arizona, and I have not had 1 second of training at any point in my law enforcement career about prevention of skin cancer in law enforcement officers. Yet every room I went into at the police academies in Australia provided sunscreen. And I'm thinking, well, that's a pretty simple thing. You can prevent skin cancer by certain skills and certain preventative measures. Well, we can prevent skin cancer in the United States, but we don't. But more frequently, we can prevent obesity in our police officers. Now, we're at a 40% incidence of obesity, one researcher finds, yet we stress physical fitness throughout the entire months of their academy, yet for the most part, we ignore it. And we don't explain to them the relationships between high rates of adrenal cortical stimulation necessary in hypervigilance and gaining weight incrementally around the abdominal area. We don't talk about that. We don't talk about the impact of metabolic illness and heart disease and stroke. And these are things we can prevent. So I think one of the things that motivated me was in revising the book and writing it was what isn't being said today in 2021. In 1980, 1990, 2000, it was very easy because there weren't that many things being said. But today we have a rich profession and many, many colleagues contributing and working and making innovations and dealing with trauma and counseling services and peer support for police. but I still am not hearing a lot about the physiological illnesses that occur to police. And so that's also, I wanted to add that voice to the choir, so our cops know that practicing officer safety and being in that elevated level of alertness, it keeps you alive tactically, also sets you up for some serious illnesses when you don't undo it every day. And again, we can do far better than we're doing in law enforcement today.
Absolutely, and I'm so glad you wrote the revised edition for all of these reasons. And you have absolutely been a pioneer in terms of, well, in so many ways, but specifically here on talking about the interconnection of physical and mental wellness. That's such a key critical point. You know, we talk about the stigma associated with emotional and mental wellness and help seeking in the profession. Of course, well documented, National Fraternal Order of Police late November 2018 surveyed 8,000 law enforcement across the United States, found that 90% report there's a stigma in the profession that keeps them from seeking help for emotional or behavioral issues. And I've always thought one of the key ways that we can combat that stigma is to emphasize the connection between physical health and mental health, because that's really a false dichotomy. These two things are completely interconnected, and there's no stigma, of course, associated with seeking help for physical health or exercising or doing things to improve your physical health. But you've always talked about that interconnection. So, and I know you've emphasized that even much more in the revised edition. So, Dr. Gilmartin, what are your thoughts on the connection between mental and physical health?
Well, you know, I don't know that they're my thoughts, is what research tells us. I mean, there's clearly alleviation of depressive symptoms with physical activity. I mean, they're axiomatically connected. And one of the things that I look for is how we don't take advantage of that. You know, I always like to quote a very basic, very simple study out of Duke University. Every class I do, I preach this study. They found that patients that present themselves with depression, when they're broken into categories of treatment by counseling or a combination of counseling and pharmaceuticals, or just walking on a treadmill for 20 minutes a day, the 20 minutes of moderate exercise had the same treatment effects as counseling and treatment with medication. Now, that doesn't mean stop taking medication or stop seeing the psychologist. What it means is we have to increase the activity thresholds of our police officers. And it shouldn't be something that the officer just does on his or her own personal time after work. It should be, in my opinion, on duty, compensated, and that officer should, at every shift, there should be a segment of time addressing those issues. If we want men and women to make sound judgments in rapid periods of time, which we demand of our police, then we have to look at what the human performance is to do that. And again, we're missing that entire concept in American law enforcement. We don't think about it. And I look at sometimes the injuries that are so preventable. Right before COVID hit, I was spending about 2 weeks with a large police department, and I was staying at a hotel. And at the hotel, every day I'd get picked up by an officer who would drive me to the academy. And these were all officers on light duty. And what astounded me was I asked them what they said. They were on light duty, and I said, why are you on light duty? Did I have a back injury? That I have a herniated disc in my lower back. I said, oh, it was about the fourth cop that had a herniated disc in their lower back. I said, can I ask you a question? They said, sure. I said, how much training did you receive for the prevention of low back injuries? They said, well, none. I said, oh, okay. I said, that's interesting, because our colleagues at the fire service, they get training in it. They get training in how to lift things. They get training in mobility. One of my hobbies is I'm an assistant coach with a running group in Oregon. And I was watching them build a bridge one day. And here come these big steel workers. These are big, muscular guys and big, strong, you know, they're steel workers. They do hard physical labor. And before they go up on the steel, they form a big circle and they stretch. And they put on this goofy music and they dance to the music, and they're stretching their lower back and they're stretching their limbs. And it looked ridiculous. But I asked one of them, why do you do that? He said, can you imagine being up on that steel and all day and having a back issue? I said, it's not possible. I said, no. And as I'm looking at that, I'm thinking, that's what we expect our officers to do. Sit in a patrol car 8-10 hours a day with defensive equipment around their waist. And we don't speak to them about, as muscles tighten from stress, the risk of injury, something very preventable, yet a very career-ending injury for the most part. And we do nothing to prevent them. I find the same things with suicide. The numbers you're talking about, Dr. Black, are astounding. And those numbers shouldn't be hidden under a bushel basket. They need to be spoken about at every police leadership, every union leadership meeting that there is, so we know how prevalent these issues are. The issue of stigma needs to be addressed. And I think it's interesting how we practice an outdated form of clinical services. I was talking to a very well-respected psychologist who's been around for many decades, and he's identified with a very large police department. And he was getting grief from his colleagues, his psychologist colleagues, because he played on the softball team at his police department. And they thought that was unethical, that he would play on the softball team because it was violating boundaries. And I'm thinking, no, you should be playing on the softball team. You should be at every in-service training. You need to be woven and embedded into the fabric of law enforcement. I think the Canadian service model that I see is better at best than the American one is. We don't have a psychologist in their office with the sign up. They don't. We do with the sign. The doctor is in. No, they're more visible. I would like to see our mental health services as part of the whole delivery team, as on call to assist with psychiatric emergencies, to assist the officers, not just in their operational services, but in what's taking place in their personal lives. And until we kind of move into that direction, I think we're still going to have these tragic numbers like you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and a lot of the best connections, of course, they happen when you're doing ride-alongs or when you're hanging out informally or when you're on the softball team, that kind of thing. So, and just to come back to that mind-body connection, that mental and physical health connection, you brought up so many great examples there, but the list goes on and on, right? I mean,
Sure.
We know, for example, depression is associated with decreased life expectancy. Post-traumatic stress disorder associated with decreased life expectancy. Alcohol abuse associated with decreased life expectancy. And then we've got suicidal ideation and suicide, of course. And when we're talking about the mortal threat to the lives of those out there doing the most important, dangerous, high-risk work in our societies, we have to pay more attention to these issues. Gut health, of course, we know is tied to mental health. You got to ask the question, why have we historically separated these things when they are so interconnected?
I think you answered the question. It's historic. I think Descartes asked the same question, centuries ago, and this whole mind-body separation. I think it had to do with how we transitioned from being theocracies to being democracies. But one of the things I looked at when I was trying to find out why are these illnesses happening to cops, and the more I could read, I kept referring back to the work of Dr. John Violante, who empirically determined the different disease entities and the epidemiological rates that impact policing. I think his excellent work, Dying for the Job, his book articulates these. But as I read that and looked through it, one of the things that struck me is in almost all of these disease entities, there were common flags that popped up. And whether we're talking about heart disease or diabetes and cancers, we looked at incremental weight gain, the levels of obesity, and sleep disorder. And those two just seem to occur repetitively. And I always say, in my mind's eye, those are the two markers of police stress. Trauma exposure, yes, those are stressors that can precipitate a reaction, but the precursors to clinical impairment, I believe, are that incremental weight gain that creeps in. And again, cops are always joking about the donuts and joking about gaining weight, but it's not a joking matter, and that's again that whole metabolic syndrome of stress, where the adrenal cortical response leads to infusion of glucose into the fat cells around the abdominal area. But the other is sleep disorder. And when we have sleep disorder, we start having impairment in reaction time and judgment. And so the very things that will make our officers better tactically, in this case, when we do interventions for incremental weight gain and stop normalizing it, and training and sleep impairment, then we start maybe preventing these diseases from occurring. And I look at curriculums, and many times there's very rarely at in-service training do officers have and their partners receive training in sleep hygiene. It should be a core element to every bit like firearms or defensive tactics or driving. Those are skills that our officers have to have with what we expect them to do.
Yeah,
I'm always amazed.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, I'm always amazed at how many professions are more advanced than law enforcement. And we almost wear our sleep deprivation in law enforcement as some red badge of courage on our sleeve. That, you know, I hear officers talking about how they did a double shift and they got 2 hours of sleep and had to appear in court, then work their off-duty job and reported back on duty. And I'm thinking that has to stop. We cannot permit officers to do that.
Well, the latest research I saw is that 75% of officers receive insufficient sleep on their shift nights. So that's, of course, a problem. And then we know insufficient sleep is associated with incremental weight gain too. So those two things are directly connected.
They go hand in hand together, and our profession just ignores them. Prior to the pandemic, I was a very veteran airplane rider. It seemed like, 5 nights a week I'm getting on an airplane someplace. And, there's flight delays and there's weather delays for all kinds of reasons. And I'm always amazed at how they'll say, we have to get this flight out within the next 10 minutes or we can't take off because the crew will have to take they can't be on duty for more than X number of hours per day. And I'm sitting thinking, you're going to basically get on a plane and pass out peanuts. I'm not berating anybody's profession, okay, when I say this, but what we're demanding from you of a flight attendant is far less than what we're demanding if you were a police officer. And yet we're going to permit that police officer to be in their 20th hour of sustained wakefulness when we know that their reaction times and their judgments are equivalent to blood alcohol levels that we would not permit them to operate a motor vehicle. But we're permitting them to stay on duty. And so when I think of suicide in a police officer, my first reflection is not back to what psychological issue was going on, but what psychological, physiological issues, sleep deprivation. How is this officer functioning biologically and psychologically? Not just did something traumatic happen that didn't get resolved. I think it's more complex than that.
Well, I think you're really good at explaining how officer safety leads to hypervigilance, which leads to the biological roller coaster, which then ties into all these long-term health impacts.
Well, one of the things I'd like to stress too is when I say cop, I don't just mean the post-certified peace officer in that state. I'm talking about the dispatcher. I'm talking about the correctional officer. I'm talking about the deputy sheriff, the federal agent, the game and fish person, people who have to go into environments and be hypervigilant and stay within that hypervigilant state for protracted periods of time. They're the ones that we're setting up for the depression and the sleep disorder and the illnesses that follow. And we could just very simplistically just do so much better. But again, you can't solve a problem if you don't know what the problem is. And when I look at this, and again, relating back to what I said earlier, being an old guy has a few advantages. You get the senior discount at the local restaurant or something. But what you also get is having seen things evolve. And what I've seen is watching my friends age and watching people who you knew as a 23-year-old police officer, then getting to watch them get robbed of the last third of their life. And they do get robbed. They say our life is broken into thirds. 1/3 is your developmental stage, where you're going to school and you're preparing for your professional life. Then 1/3 is your professional life. You're a teacher, you're a nurse, you're a cop. And you spend 1/3 of your life. Then for most people with life expectancy, that last third is their encore years. That's when they they're going to be retired and they're going to go play golf every day or ride their Harley across the country. And what happens to police officers is they pay the price by losing that encore part of their life, that last third. And that troubles me. I see the sacrifice that law enforcement officers do for all these years of service. Then you want them to have rich, long retirements and all the things that they've put off. But you can't wait and do that 6 months before the officer retires. You want the officer doing that from day one, having training in this area. So they maintain physical and psychological well-being.
Well, one thing we've talked about, Dr. Gilmartin, on those lines is how reactive the profession is in so many ways. Can you please discuss the importance of proactive, brief goal setting each day for law enforcement?
Well, law enforcement by definition is reactive. We're in the field, first responders. They don't know what they're going to do on any given day. They show up to work and the call comes down and they have to handle it. And they become very good at that. But that whole worldview of being reactive combined with the biological roller coaster, the officer gets off duty and drops into this depressive-like state and waits until they feel like doing something. Well, we have to train them to know that feeling isn't going to occur. It isn't going to occur, and that's the physiological state that they're in. So when they have a specific, tangible goal, they don't get off duty wondering what they're going to do tonight. They get off duty knowing, well, it's Tuesday night. I coach my daughter's softball team tonight. They don't say, I feel like coaching my daughter's softball team. They just know I go coach my daughter's softball team. That the behavior occurs first, and then the emotion changes. And it's and that's an orientation towards time that most people don't have to worry about because they don't have to deal with this real high elevated roller coaster that drops them into this state. Most people get off duty and they transition to their personal life very, very seamlessly. I was at a family gathering a few days ago, and one of the people there in the family is a firefighter. We have to admit that. We have some firefighters in our family, but jokingly, but mostly cops. But they were talking about how they got moved into a position off the streets, off the line, just temporarily. And he was talking about how he can't wait to get back on the line to work in the streets again. And I asked, why is that? And one of the issues was how much more time he had, how easy it was to do the things in his personal life that he didn't get to do in the other time issue. Our police officers get off duty and they drop into this detached, exhausted state. I'm often amazed at watching shift change at dispatch centers or at correctional institutions and watching the difference between how the staff is walking into the institution and watching how the staff walks out of the institution. And it reminds me of sitting in the Las Vegas airport and watching the differences between people who are arriving in Las Vegas, and there's a skip to their step as they're walking off the plane in Vegas, and then watching the people just drag back on the plane as they're getting out of town. And our law enforcement people, they're just every day, they just leave. It's like they're leaving Las Vegas and they're just depleted, they're detached. Then they go back to their loved ones, and they go back to their personal life, where we want them to be resilient and have rich, full lives. They're just played out. So helping them make that transition and understand what's going on, I find critically important.
Yeah, absolutely. So well said, Dr. Gilmartin. And there's countless other things I want to talk to you about, but one thing I want to make sure we get to in today's webinar is the lethal triad. You and I have spoken about that lately. Can you please explain what is the lethal triad? Why is it so important?
Well, I call the lethal triad like a trap. It's when three emotions occur simultaneously: anger, isolation, and projection of blame. And when these three things occur at the same time, you have somebody that's isolated. And, isolation is the fertile ground for radicalization. When you only have one form of thought, you only have one way of viewing the world. And it's very easy to get isolated today. Even though we're in the super age of information, people lock on the information that just confirms their bias. We're not looking for information, we're looking for affirmation. So it's very easy for us when we're not socializing, when we're pulling back from other social encounters, and we just pretty much hang with people who think like us. It's very easy to get isolated into one ideological perception of the world. But then we combine that with anger. And anger is when our expectations get violated. You know, we want something to be different than it is, and we have no control how to change it. And it just angers us that this goes on. So we're going to have somebody who's sort of isolated, they're locked in their world of anger, but then the solution is we get projection of blame. We now have somebody to blame. And in law enforcement officers have always been potentially victimized by projection of blame, and this triad that takes place. And you know, it's why you hear in law enforcement, people would always complain that the biggest source of stress in law enforcement was management. You'd hear this all the time. And it was because management controlled that singular identity that is easy to happen in law enforcement, and they would get locked into it. And yet you'd find officers who didn't have the isolation. They didn't get into this trap of this lethal triad. They had rich, full personal lives. They weren't regurgitating the latest stressor at work. On their days off, they were working on their golf game. They were riding their Harley. They were racing their mountain bike, whatever they were doing. And in some ways, the entry-level generation of police officers comes in with that social orientation already. And some people will complain there's a lack of commitment to work ethic. Well, that's a blessing for first responders, that they have rich personal lives. But it isn't just a social dynamic, it's a biological component too. Once they hit that depression, will they continue doing that? But we break that lethal triad by socializing, by interacting, by becoming members of the community. And then again, it's an educational format. It's bringing partners in and speaking with them and having classes that are meaningful to these issues. And when we do that, we can have rich, vibrant police officers that survive the careers. I'm always amazed when I see some guy who's been a cop forever, and then they retire, and they've been retired forever, and they're just positive. They have a outlook on life. They're engaged in living in the moment. They're not regurgitating with anger what happened 15 years previously. And those are the victims that we talk about in the book. And having officers appreciate do control and don't control, like we talked earlier, so terribly important, because right now they're just being inundated with issues that they don't control, and they have to go in and serve the public. It's one of the costs of policing in a democracy. You know, in totalitarian, authoritarian states, the cops don't have to put up with that. It would be nice to think that, no, it wouldn't be nice. Living in a democracy where people have freedom of speech is the world where I want to live. But to be a police officer and balance officer safety with people's First Amendment rights to say whatever they want. It's, you know, free speech is content neutral. So it might not be what you want to hear, but people have the right to say that. And going out every day and being inundated in things you don't control means you have to get off duty and go back to a world where you do control. You set tangible, specific things that you're going to do with your friends and your loved ones, and balance out that life. And when our police officers can do that, I think they get through these stressful events more effectively.
Absolutely.
And that kind of,
yeah.
But it also spins into that whole world of peer support. You know, the cop who's walked the walk with you understands these things, and the dispatcher is there not just for helping diffuse traumatic events, but just getting through life.
Absolutely. Well, great recommendation, focusing on what you can control and appreciating the distinction between what you can and cannot control. And that really brings us back to where we started. Fortunately, emotional survival and wellness are within the control of our nation's heroes, and the revised edition of Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement could absolutely not have come at a better time. Crawford, do we have some time for questions?
Yeah, we sure do. So you guys have actually touched on what several of the questions were, but maybe we can put a finer point on some of them. The first one we have, and we have several to this effect, are can you please address correctional officer stress? And I think dispatch stress might also be relevant too.
Well, from my perspective, there's no difference. If you're in a hypervigilant state and you're sitting on that console as a dispatcher, you don't know what's going to happen, and you have to be ready to go from 0 to 100 at any given in a second's notice, because people's lives depend on that. And your brain is in that hypervigilant state. You're a correctional officer. Your brain's in that hypervigilant state. The same as the police officers. You know, we might have these categorizations of occupational classifications, but the stress is identical, and the body's reacting to it identically. And we need to address them. Many times, those are the unsung heroes, the people behind the scenes that are doing the jobs that don't get the glory that other jobs do. But we have to do those services to assist everybody on the team and addressing that.
Yeah, and exactly right, Dr. Gilmartin. They're similar in so many ways. The exposure to high stress, the exposure to high risk, therefore you get that sympathetic nervous system response. So you have all the physical and mental health correlates of that. But one major distinction, right, is we so often overlook the dispatchers. We so often overlook the correctional officers. And they demand a lot more of our focus and attention because the work they do is heroic. And just take correction officers, for example, the data for correctional officers is terrible. I mean, 1 out of 10 having suicidal thoughts, high rates of post-traumatic stress and depression, and just an underattended to population. So of course, we offer Cortico Guardian for corrections professionals. So very, very important.
You know, Dr. Black, I was speaking to a large state Department of Corrections executive staff, and they just had a wellness survey done, and it said that 80% of their employees had significant weight gain in their first year of employment. And these were well-intentioned leaders, but they were conceptualizing it totally along nutritional lines, not along stress lines. And I just asked them, you need to address this issue. It's not unrelated to issues of suicide. So absolutely, across the spectrum.
Thank you for that answer, or those answers. Another question that we've had come in, and we've actually had, again, several to this effect is, would you, Dr. Gilmartin, Dr. Black, talk about some of the advantages of having a peer support team in place, and also any tips for setting up an effective peer support team?
Well, I don't think anybody could be more supportive of peer support than I am. I think that's most things that have helped us have come from peers in law enforcement. When you look at it from decades and decades ago, where they had Alcoholics Anonymous programs was strictly for police officers, cops helping cops, up to starting in the 1980s, the critical incident traumatic response teams and the debriefings. But they take all different shapes. I was fly fishing, confess to this, not too terribly long ago. I'm walking along a river in Oregon, and another fly fisherman's walking the same path we meet, and we're just chatting each other up. And in a few minutes, I find out that he's a law enforcement officer, and what he does is, after traumatic events, he takes dispatchers and police officers out and teaches them to fly fish. And it's kind of like the Healing Waters programs that they have with veterans helping other veterans after the war traumas. I'm amazed at the growth of our peer support, not just from the traditional clinical issues.
Mm-hmm.
I was doing some work in Texas and had a couple of cowboys come up and that were war veterans, and they do equine therapy with cops, firefighters, and veterans that are dealing with trauma, and they use horses for it. So it comes in lots of different shapes, but also from the traditional clinical approach. I think there's some wonderful folks out there. Dr. Nancy Bowl and some others are doing just some wonderful work in training and setting up appropriate peer support programs.
Absolutely. So well said. Yeah, big fan of Dr. Nancy Bull and her work. And I would say if you don't have a peer support team, one of the best things you can do to strengthen your agency is establish a peer support team. If you already have a peer support team, one of the best things you can do is say, how can we better support and strengthen our peer support team? Some of the keys are there. One, emphasize confidentiality. When I look at peer support teams that have unfortunately failed, the number one reason in my experience is because some sort of breach of confidentiality. So you really want to emphasize that. The other thing I would say is select the right people to be on the peer support team. One key strategy that helps with that is have people in the department nominate other people to be on the peer support team. So you have to be nominated to be on it. Have your policy set up for your peer support team in advance, so everybody knows the rules you're playing by, and then provide them with ongoing training and support. And additionally, I would say it's really, really important to make the peer support team accessible. It's one thing to have the peer support team. It's another thing so that everyone knows who they are and how to access them 24 hours a day. And traditionally, if you're a large agency, if you're a state agency or a large sheriff's office or a large major city police, for example, what you're typically going to run into as a problem is people won't know who's on the peer support team. It's so large. How do I know who to connect with? And if I actually know someone on the peer support team, that's probably the person I don't want to connect with because I want there to be more of a layer of confidentiality probably. On the other hand, if you're a smaller agency, the problem that you tend to run into is the department's so small that it's hard to form a robust peer support team. And so what we found to be really helpful there is to pool resources across multiple agencies. For example, pull together peer support teams across multiple agencies, make them easily accessible to everyone. So,
and if I could just add something to the whole picture of peer support, and what Dr. Black is talking about in the clinical peer support, absolutely essential. But I'd like to broaden the spotlight for peer support also to other issues. Whereas, in getting back to peer support programs, using kind of almost a CrossFit model where we have groups that meet where peers are helping other peers deal with issues that you wouldn't consider it just clinical services, but we're breaking that isolation. We're giving people groups to work with. We're giving them softball teams to play on, and we're and having management, both administration and labor, look at the need to have cops help other cops and to provide that services for the quality of their life.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's great. And this, I'm just going to ad lib a question because I'm kind of interested in this. Dr. Black, you've been talking a lot about post-traumatic growth and sort of this idea. I think it's something, Dr. Gilmartin, you've touched on several times during this webinar, is that a stressful event can be an opportunity to grow and learn as well. Would you like to talk to that, Dr. Black? And then I'd be interested in your thoughts as well, of course, Dr. Gilmartin.
Yeah, Crawford, I'm glad you asked that question. It's such a great one. The way I see it is, if you tear your rotator cuff, you're not going to grow a bionic shoulder, right? That's not the way it works physically. But the nice thing is with emotional injuries, it can work exactly that way if you get the right help and support. That's why we call it post-traumatic growth. It's the most difficult things we go through in life often are the things that really shape us and make us exceptional people. When you look at people who are great leaders or who have a big impact on the profession or the officers in your agency that you really, really look up to, they've probably been through some pretty bad stuff. It's probably a lot of the toughest things they've ever been through that really shape them into the leader they are or the role model that they are. And so I emphasize that because it's very inspirational. You think about going through horrible critical incidents, horrible traumatic events. A lot of our first responders had really, really tough childhoods. That stuff builds you into the person you are. The key here is getting help and normalize help seeking. We need to flip the script and emphasize the fact that seeking help is a hallmark signal of strength. It's a hallmark signal of being a strong team player. It's a hallmark signal of being resilient, is reaching out and asking for help when you need it. The reason that's so important is healing and recovering after stressors and traumas makes all the difference. That's the difference between, these things destroy you over time or you get stronger and stronger over time. It's really no different than, say, an Olympic powerlifter, right? They go in and they put enormous stress and strain on their body. but then they eat a lot of protein and they get plenty of sleep. Now, if they didn't do that, their system would just completely break down over time. But by virtue of putting that stress strain on the system and then getting the healing and recovery necessary, they become stronger than they ever could have been without going through that stress and strain. That's really what post-traumatic growth is all about.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can add something, you know, Dr. Black, I think what's just been so ingenious that you've been able to do is to take that clinical expertise that you possess and to weld it with today's technology. So first responders can utilize Cortico to just access information that they would not have previously been able to obtain, that you've really lived that, you know, the world is flat belief. We can get that information to people no matter where you are, and you're getting information that's up to date, it's world class, and because you can't solve a problem if you don't know what it is, and you've been able to get that information to folks.
Thanks so much, Dr. Gilmartin. I really appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. I think we're just about out of time, but this has been fascinating, and I know that everybody on this webinar has learned a lot. I certainly have. Dr. Gilmartin, we're all very excited about your new book. We have a slide up there where anybody can go and find the book, buy it for a friend, a loved one, somebody who's getting into this career that you know, is starting out new, and get them that foundation before they get themselves into trouble. And then, of course, we have, yeah, well, I mean, and Dr. Gilmartin, I have heard many law enforcement officers say that your book, they thought that you had read their diaries because you knew them so intimately. You painted such a convincing portrait of this dysfunction that's very common among first responders.
Thank you. I thank you for pointing out the book. I just like to say that the cops really wrote the book. It's really their story, and all we did was put it in black and white.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons it's so good too. But then, and the other thing that we have up there is something that Dr. Black and I did a while back, how to start how to create a peer support team, critical incident self-care tip sheet as well. We have a lot of different resources there if you go to this URL. And as always, please keep in touch. We'll have more webinars coming up at LexPol always. And to everybody who's tuned in today, thank you so much for all that you do. Thank you, Dr. Gilmartin, Dr. Black, and we will talk to you later.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone. Bye-bye.